Office Memorandum. Walter Neff to damnful idealistic Crusader, Video Claims Manager. Dear Crusader, I suppose you'll call this a confession when you hear it. I don't like the word confession. I just want to set you right about one thing you couldn't see, because it was smack up against your nose. You think you're such a hot potato as a video claim manager, such a wolf on a phony disc. Well, maybe you are, Crusader, but let's take a look at this Criterion UHD claim, archival and double indemnity. You were pretty good in there for a while, all right. You said it wasn't fully archival. Check. You said it wasn't superlative. Check. You said it was disappointing. Check and double check. You thought you had a cold, all wrapped up in tissue paper with pink ribbons around it. It was perfect, except that it wasn't, because you made a mistake. Just one tiny little mistake. When it came to picking the killer, you picked the wrong guy, if you know what I mean. Want to know who killed Double Indemnity's audio? Hold tight to that cheap pretzel of yours, Crusader. I killed the audio. Me, Walter Neff, mastering engineer, 35 years old, unmarried, no visible scars. Until a little while ago, that is. Yes, I killed it. I killed it for 4K pictures, sound, and extras. And I didn't get the audio, and I didn't get all the extras I wanted. Pretty, isn't it? It began last May. About the end of May it was. I had to run out to Glendale to deliver a policy on some dairy trucks. On the way back I remembered the Barnes & Noble sale, so I decided to run over there. It was mid-afternoon, and it's funny. I can still remember the smell of honeysuckle all along the block. I felt like a million. There was no way in all this world I could have known that video murder sometimes can smell like honeysuckle.
No? Look, Kino, every month hundreds of video claims come to this desk. Some of them are phonies, and I know which ones. How do I know, Kino? Because my little man tells me.
What little man?
The little man in here. Every time one of those phonies comes along, he ties knots in my stomach. And yours was one of them, Kino. That's how I knew your video claim was crooked. So what did I do? I examined your Blu-ray release carefully and compared the audio to past releases. And what did I find, Kino? I found a screwy old master in the wrong audio track.
What track?
The audio track someone at some point soaked with kerosene and dropped a match on.
Look, Mr. Crusader, I'm just a poor label. Maybe I made a mistake.
That's one way of putting it.
I ain't feeling so good, Mr. Crusader.
Sign this and you'll feel fine. Right there, it's a waiver on your video claim. Now you're an honest label again.
But I gotta do a disc recall program.
Goodbye, Kino.
Goodbye, Mr. Crusader. Disc recall program and admitting mistakes. That's a lot of dough where I live.
What's the matter, Kino? Don't you know how to admit you made a mistake? Just be humble, admit the errors, and make the corrections.
Like this, Mr. Crusader?
That's the label. Now the same thing on all of them.
Thank you, Mr. Crusader.
What kind of an outfit is this anyway? Are we an insurance company or a bunch of dim-witted amateurs writing a policy on a mug like that?
Oh, wait a minute, Crusader. I don't rate this beef. I clipped a note to that Kino application to have him thoroughly investigated before we accepted the risk.
I know you did, Walter. I'm not beefing at you. It's the studios and labels, the way they do things, the way they don't do things, the way they'll throw out anything just to get it down on the sales sheet. And I'm the guy that has to sit here up to my neck in phony video claims so people won't throw more money out the window on bad discs.
Okay, turn the record over and let's hear the other side.
I get darn sick of picking up after a gang of fast-talking studios dumb enough to wreck film transfers that were perfectly fine to begin with. I've had 20 years of that, Walter, and
you loved every minute of it, Crusader. You love it, only you worry about it too much, you and your little man. You're so darn conscientious you're driving yourself crazy. You wouldn't even say what audio track is on the disc unless you put the disc in the player and looked at it yourself. And then you would check the audio track by capturing it and looking at it in sound software and comparing it to past releases, which you also captured. And then if you could verify what the audio transfer source was.
That's enough for me, Walter. Now get out of here before I throw my desk at you.
I love you too.
I hate it. I loathe going back to the Blu-ray. You believe me, don't you, Walter?
Sure, I believe you.
I can't stand it anymore. What if they did hang me?
You're not going to hang, baby.
It's better than going on this way without a UHD.
You're not going to hang, baby, not ever. Because you're going to do it the smart way. Because I'm going to help you.
You?
Me.
Do you know what you're saying?
Sure I know what I'm saying. We're going to do the 4K master together. We're going to do it right. And I'm the guy that knows how.
Walter, you're hurting me.
There isn't going to be any 4K slip-up. Nothing sloppy, nothing weak. It's got to be perfect. You go now. Call me tomorrow, but not from your house, from a booth, and watch your step every single minute. It's got to be perfect, understand? Straight down the line.
Straight down the line.
Look, Walter, the job I'm talking about takes brains and integrity. It takes more guts than there is in 50 reviewers. It's the hardest job in the business. It's still a desk job. I don't want a desk job. A desk job. Is that all you can see in it? Just a hard chair to park your pants on from 9 to 5. Just a pile of discs to shuffle around, and editing software, and a sound editor to make audio comparisons on, with maybe a little doodling on the side. That's not the way I see it, Walter. To me, a video claims man is a surgeon, and that desk is an operating table, and that software is scalpels and bone chisels. And those discs are not just movies and shows and extras for consumption. They're alive. They're packed with drama, with twisted hopes and crooked dreams. A video claims man, Walter, is a doctor and a bloodhound and a cop and a judge and a jury and a father confessor all in one. And you want to tell me you're not interested. You don't want to work with your brains. All you want to work with is your face on a thumbnail for a few bucks more a week.
There's a widespread feeling that just because a man has a large office at a studio, he must be an idiot. Hello, Crusader. What's on your mind?
That audio track. The label did new audio mastering.
What are you talking about?
Talking about the Criterion UHD. It had a new audio transfer, didn't it? Then it sounds better than the Blu-ray, doesn't it?
So what?
And it didn't advertise the audio restoration. Why didn't it put that in the press release? Why?
What the dickens are you driving at?
Walter, there's something wrong. I ate dinner 2 hours ago. It's stuck halfway. The little man is acting up again because there's something wrong with that Criterion double indemnity case.
Because it didn't put in an audio claim? Maybe it just didn't have time.
Or maybe it just didn't know it would be investigated. No, that couldn't be it. You did the work personally, didn't you, Walter? And you got it right.
Sure I did.
Got any bicarbonate of soda?
No, I haven't.
Listen, Walter, I've been living with this little man for 20 years. He's never failed me yet. There's got to be something wrong. Come in, Walter. I want to ask you something. After all the years we've known each other, do you mind if I make a rather blunt statement?
About what?
About me, Walter. I'm a very great man. This Criterion double indemnity business. It's audio murder, and murders don't come any neater. As fancy a piece of audio homicide as anybody ever ran into. Smart and tricky and almost perfect, but I think Papa has it all figured out and wrapped up in tissue paper with pink ribbons on it.
I'm listening.
You know what? That new audio track isn't as good as the old Laserdisc.
It isn't?
No, it isn't, Walter. Look, you can't be sure of killing an audio track by making a new transfer. The only way you can be sure is to kill with some noise reduction and processing first, and then throw it on the disc. That would mean either killing it in the processing or, and this is where it really gets fancy, you're killing it in the mastering and putting it on the disc. Two possibilities, and I personally buy the second.
You're way ahead of me, Crusader. Don't tell me it's because you've been in love with me all this time.
No, I never loved you, Walter, not you or anybody else. I'm rotten to the heart. I used you just as you said. All I wanted was the Criterion 4K UHD until a minute ago. I didn't think anything like that could ever happen to me.
Sorry, baby, I'm not buying.
Hello and welcome back to this damn fully idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the Criterion dual format release on both Blu-ray and 4K UHD of one of the immortal cinematic treasures, 1944's Double Indemnity, which was of course directed by Billy Wilder and written by both Billy Wilder and Raymond Chandler from the James M. Cain original novel, which formed the basis of the film, but Wilder and Chandler took things into a far more refined level, so much so that while the film does retain the vast majority of the book and some of the dialogue, there are many changes throughout, particularly in tone, and many characters are strengthened and some characters are changed entirely. So while at their core they are very similar, they are of course also extraordinarily different. And this film is also unique in Wilder's output because it was the one time he worked with Chandler, and this meeting of, I think, two of the greatest artistic minds of the 20th century and two of the most brilliant men who ever lived, it makes this film so incredibly unique. And of course, it was Double Indemnity that cemented the idea of what we now look at and refer to as film noir, as being something that was not only successful, but also achieved critical and audience recognition and was also nominated for multiple Academy Awards. So it had both the monetary returns of being a box office success, but also was a critical and industry success and was seen as a higher achieving picture, and its success meant that other studios realized you could do crime stories, or what they would term crime stories or detective stories, or something in this sort of realm, and it be well received and successful. This of course is just really drawing elements from what we also now refer to as the school of hard-boiled fiction, primarily focused around the big three writers of Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and James M. Cain, among many others, and all of these writers came out of the pulp magazines. So this meant that Hollywood started picking up and adapting a lot of these stories, and doing stories that previously obviously would be harder to get through the production code. Double Indemnity was just like Kane's most famous novel, The Postman Always Rings Twice, famously sort of banned by the production code, and nobody could really touch it until Chandler and Wilder figured out ways to get this story about two people who come together to decide to do away with an inconvenient husband, and figured out how to get it through the production code, and most importantly, how to not completely alienate an audience, because you're following two murderers essentially, and you have to keep them from ever becoming completely unlikable. Double Indemnity sort of opened the floodgates for what became the what we look at as the film noir movement. So before this point, it's really the Maltese Falcon with a few other precedents that were already there, but Double Indemnity is where all of this stuff really crystallized, and everybody else saw it was a successful idea and that you could get away with a film like this. It also meant that finally MGM could do something with The Postman Always Rings Twice, which was even more hated by the production code. Of course, to get that story into a film version in the 40s, they had to significantly alter it and water it down immensely. So the MGM version is really a pale imitation of Kane's novel, but it has a lot of the same story structure and elements similar to Double Indemnity, so it was an equally difficult, if not an even more difficult book to adapt to also, again, not alienate an audience. So without this film, there would be so much of the Hollywood landscape would be different from this time period. It's also a film that, of course, really needs no introduction. It's also a film that's been endlessly discussed and has been analyzed over and over, and people even study the screenplay, as you should, because it's one of the most beautifully written films ever. And that speaks to just how beautifully constructed the film is, and how it has an internal rhythm and not only a sense of fatalism, but also a sense of sardonic humor, as if the film is constantly commenting on itself. And you feel the voice of Wilder and Chandler constantly having this dialogue with you as the audience. That is, if you come to the film over repeat viewings and it becomes a cherished old friend, and you're able to look past the surface level of the story and see all of the incredible themes that they're playing with, along with some elements of social satire and building up and tweaking things and altering things from Kane's much more direct original novel, although they are using the same core basic framework. So it is an absolutely iconic landmark. It is one of the greatest films ever made. It's one of the most beautifully executed films ever made, and it is literally perfect. It is perfect in its construction, in its beautiful photography by John F. Seitz, in its direction by Billy Wilder, and you have arguably three career best performances that are atypical for our lead three actors of Fred MacMurray, Barbara Stanwyck, and Eddie G. Robinson. All three being pushed and asked to do things outside of their comfort zone and excelling so much so that you really forget about the performances because the characters are so vivid and alive in your mind. And again, all of this is picking up what Kane put down on the page, but you have Raymond Chandler working on James M. Cain's framework, and Kane was great at making swift, fast, shorter stories with a real hard edge and a point, but he wasn't in the same mindset as Chandler, who could take just anything and develop it into just some of the most beautifully thoughtful and striking prose you'll ever encounter in literature. I may be biased, he is my favorite author, but I think it's a fascinating example of having another famous name of the same sort of genre with a completely different style coming in and reworking a different famous name who has a different approach that the other writer is not really a fan of. And of course, Wilder and Chandler got on like oil and water, or so they battled constantly, but that particular friction, I think, causes the actual final film to have even more energy than it would have. And it's got a different flavor to Wilder's other partnerships, particularly with Charles Brackett or even with I.A.L. Diamond later on. So Wilder famously would have writing partners in terms of doing the screenplay first, and then he would go and direct the film. But this is partly why this film is so unique. It's not just a watershed moment for this genre in Hollywood and that it was successful, and a watershed moment for having so much lightning in a bottle in terms of really developing what became a genre and getting actors and actresses to so step aside their comfort zone and create these iconic performances. But it's also completely unique for being the one time Billy Wilder and Raymond Chandler could stand each other long enough to be in the same room to finish a screenplay. And it is a marvel of construction, of directing, of photography, of performance, of the musical score by Miklos Rosa. Every single element of this film is so meticulously worked out, but always with a sense of that sardonic wit, that particular touch that only Billy Wilder could have. And he admitted his real goal was to try and out Hitchcock. That was what he had in his mind. But Double Indemnity remains uniquely Billy Wilder's voice, but with Raymond Chandler's voice in there as well. So while it has many Hitchcockian elements, it never loses that Wilder touch. Of course, Wilder was a disciple of Ernst Lubitsch, and Lubitsch was always known for the Lubitsch touch, but I think Wilder should equally be recognized for the Wilder touch. You can't see a Billy Wilder picture without realizing that Billy Wilder is behind it the whole time, and his voice is right there, and his incredible wit and his humor and his sensitivities. I mean, you could just feel him practically behind the camera doing the dialogue, and of course yelling at the actors when they didn't do his dialogue just right. But you can't not see this film and recognize that there's a humor at play, there's a knowing quality, because in some ways, Chandler and Wilder are kind of admitting that they're having one over on you, and they're inviting you into this different world that is so like our own, but just slightly more dramatized, and with the sardonic humor existent in all life, just made a little bit more obvious to inject a certain different energy into the proceedings. So the film remains not only one of the film noir touchstones, not only one of Billy Wilder's masterpieces in terms of the films he directed, but it is one of the timeless legends of the cinematic medium, and is one of the very few absolutely majestic film experiences. It never dates, it never gets old, it never dulls, and it is so meticulously crafted that the more you study it, the more you really start to appreciate it even further. This is one of those films that you can't see it enough times. You can't find out enough information about it, because the more you see it, the more you study its production, the more you study its screenplay and how it differs from Kane's novel and what Chandler and Wilder did in this screenplay. The more you study this film, the more you are absolutely enraptured by its just incredible just our artistic heights. It is one of those films that never ceases to keep giving you more material and more elements to just absolutely marvel over. So, of course, it receiving the 4K treatment in a brand new scan was extraordinarily welcome news, because the film has been handled by Universal a number of times on home video, and it's never really gotten the full deluxe treatment it deserves, and the older masters were really showing their age, and also its audio track has not been handled the best over time. So the news that not only would it get a UHD release from a new 4K scan and master, but also a deluxe release from Criterion with Dolby Vision, and also a new audio presentation of the original mono, was really something. And so I came into this release really hoping this would turn out well, and it has in most areas. But unfortunately, I do think there are some drawbacks. Obviously, some are tied to the original elements, but others, such as the audio, are not handled as well as certain past releases. And also the supplements are, while it's more than what we've had before, we've also lost some things from previous releases, and it still doesn't fully, I think, satisfy the desire to learn even more about one of the greatest films ever made. Now, to talk about the picture quality first, I want to read the restoration notes, because this film is not coming from the original negative, and this is going to be very important to read to then understand what you're seeing on the disc itself, because it helps to understand what the sources are, because this is obviously not as good as it could be, because we don't don't have the original negative to work from. So the notes state, double indemnity is presented in the original aspect ratio of 1.37 to 1. This new 4K restoration was created from a 35mm nitrate composite fine grain held by the British Film Institute, which was scanned in 4K resolution on an ARRIScan scanner in archival mode due to film shrinkage. Then a 35mm safety dupe negative created in 1986 from a fine grain source that no longer exists was used to replace frames missing from the BFI element. So this means that obviously we not only have no original negative to work from, but we're also looking at an element that did have film shrinkage and did have missing frames. So they did have to mix in elements from another source, which is a copy of an old fine grain that no longer exists. And if I had to bet, I would say that alternate source they mixed into the BFI source, that copy of a fine grain done in 1986. Well, I think I know the reason why that was done in 1986, and I think that is for the initial home video releases of the film by Universal, which happened in 1987 and 1988 with this green cover. And if you look at this transfer, it is from a print source, but it looks really good, especially for the time. So with this coming out just after 1986, my guess would be is that that alternate copy of a fine grain source is what was made and used for the initial home video releases on VHS and Laserdisc. Now, what this means on this new master is, again, you're not working from original negative, so the quality is going to be limited compared to other films of the time period that are working from the original negative. So you do need to expect that there is going to be some quality loss, and so that, along with some additional wear, is just baked into the element because that's the best we have to use. And they're having to mix and match sources, so there is going to be a little bit of variation between the two. So what we see on this master essentially is a gigantic technological leap forward over the old Universal releases. The Universal Blu-ray is really showing its age now. Although it was okay, it's really not the best. And back then, Universal was still not doing super great releases. And I think the element and what they were working from was actually kind of going back to their previous 2006 DVD master, which was the first time they tried to spiff up the film and make extras and things. And the extras for that DVD got ported to the Blu-ray, and most of those got ported over to this new release. So the 2006 was the first time Universal seemingly put a lot of effort into trying to work on the film, but their Blu-ray was basically an HD upgrade of that. So those really show their age now, and the Criterion release easily bests them on a picture level front, whether you're looking at the UHD or the Blu-ray. But of course, that means that since we're not working from original negative and we've got a mix of sources, there is some inherent wear in the element, and some shots also seem a little bit bright or have some elements that seem almost maybe a tad. They're not quite blown out, but it's just, I think, magnified by it being a higher generation element. But all video releases of this film and all preservation copies and things have always had this look baked in because we've always been working off of non-original negative sources. So if you've seen this film before, I think you'll know the sort of inherent roughness that's always been there because we've never been looking at original negative sources that are being scanned. Now, this new scan also makes the inherent damage in this source much more obvious. So throughout this transfer, you are going to see some lines that poke in, a little bit of tiny scratches that pop up here and there, and also a little bit of hairs poking in one or two different areas. It's nothing major, but it is inherent to the source they're working from. And again, they are working from this BFI element that did have film shrinkage, so they did have to really try and work hard to overcome a lot of this stuff, but there is some inherent wear in there. There's also quite a bit of quality drop-off in the transitions, because of course those are going to dupe material and then coming back to non-dupe material, so you've always got quality loss in transitions, but here it's magnified a bit because we're not working from original negative sources. It's a composite mixture of different prints, and also it's now in a 4K master, which is only going to magnify these source issues. But the presentation overall is quite natural, so none of this is extremely in your face or striking. It's all stuff that's inherent to the sources we have that survive. So this is really, I think, the best that can be done, unfortunately, with the best surviving materials. Unless somehow, miraculously, the original negative turns up and is actually usable, that's really going to be the only way that you're going to have something better, is essentially if a better source happens to turn up down the road. So again, don't go into this expecting it to be a beautiful, pristine presentation without some inherent wear and artifacts, because that's just baked into the source they're having to work from. And it's primarily the occasional little scratch or line that kind of pokes in. And again, you'll notice that some shots are a little noisier or a little brighter, as they've always been. And then the transitions themselves are obviously going to be of a lower quality. I did notice one or two spots of just a tiny amount of frame movement. So you get just a tiny bit of wobble once or twice, sort of scattered throughout the transfer. And then there's also a little bit of fluctuation in the brightness, but all of this seems to be inherent to the element, and all of this stuff has been present in past releases. So again, I think it is simply tied to these elements, and when they were made, obviously we don't have the original negative to work from, but this stuff is again baked into the sources we have, and there's not really much you can do about it. And also, again, this being a 4K master, and particularly looking at the UHD, it makes all of this stuff much more apparent because the resolution is so much greater, and it's kind of putting a magnifying glass on this stuff. So even if you've seen the film dozens of times before, you'll be seeing new details in this release, but also a lot of the source limitations are going to be much more apparent, so do keep that in mind. Now we come to the HDR, which is presented in Dolby Vision here. So usually when Criterion gets a 4K master of a classic title from a studio as part of a licensing deal, whether it's Universal or Warner, we know that Criterion doing it means that the film will get Dolby Vision, as a lot of the major studios usually skip that. Particularly Warner always does HDR10. Universal is sort of hit or miss in terms of some of their releases are Dolby Vision, some are just HDR10. And thankfully, Criterion is not one of the labels or studios that goes overboard with HDR. They are very tasteful in the HDR usage. So here, what the Dolby Vision is doing is allowing for greater contrast between the highlights and the shadows, but it's never pushing it too far to give that dreaded pop-out effect where the brightest elements are extraordinarily bright and distracting, and the darkest elements are extraordinarily dark to the point of eliminating shadow detail and details in the darker parts of the frame. Double Indemnity being one of the most iconic noirs and revered for its imagery. This is, of course, very important to have a presentation where the visual style is maintained and we don't get the unfortunate effect that happens on many catalog titles that get ruined in HDR presentations. So this being from a limited source, it's very similar to what we see on the Criterion UHD release of Citizen Kane, which similarly is not obviously working from the original negative and has definite source limitations. But just like Kane, Double Indemnity here has a lovely presentation that is enhanced by the Dolby Vision HDR, but it never overwhelms any of the imagery. It merely does what it's supposed to do and allow greater nuance in the visuals, and it's not actively pushing any elements. And you can actually go and obviously check against the included SDR Blu-ray, but also the previous Universal Blu-ray and other releases to see that we do have visual consistency in the brightness levels. But obviously the Dolby Vision allows for greater visual nuance, and doing comparisons to past releases or just the same master in SDR will show the benefits of what a properly done HDR pass will do on a new master. Again, you will notice a big difference between the UHD and the included Blu-ray in this release, even though they're from the same master. If you have a higher-end 4K television and you have the ability to do Dolby Vision, I think it will allow all the subtle nuances of what the format can provide to really show off the difference in a very limited source master in terms of the sources themselves being limited and obviously not having the greatest bump up in terms of resolution. But what the UHD is able to do with Dolby Vision is allow for greater nuance, greater detail, but also really trying to show off the master as best as possible. And so you'll notice that while it's not a giant resolution uptick or anything because of the limited source, it's all kinds of other details that become much more obvious and visible and nuanced and detailed, and it's a much more involving experience. And this is, again, the same thing that happens on the UHD of Citizen Kane in terms of the source being limited, but the UHD at first might not seem as it being a gigantic improvement, but it really is in a lot of different areas. It's also helped by the fact that at least Criterion does the encoding and presentation of their UHDs better than they do their Blu-ray discs, which is still kind of hit or miss, and sometimes their Blu-rays are not encoded well at all. And also they put all of the extras on the Blu-ray disc, which does take up more space and things. But again, this is an example where I think the UHD in terms of the picture is done about as well as it possibly can be with the source limitations and with good HDR rendering of this source master without ever overdoing it. Then we turn to the audio side of things. We have the film's original mono mix in lossless quality here, but it's also similar to what happened on the Citizen Kane release. I think these are sort of linked in a lot of ways, also both being Criterion and films of the 1940s with a history of video issues on past releases and being from very limited source elements. So this, like Kane, is a new mastering of the film's audio, which is very welcome because the past Universal releases on DVD and Blu-ray and others have had varying degrees of noise management and hiss reduction and things, and never really sounded all that good. We don't really have a super great element to work from, considering all the releases have certain issues and some degree of noise reduction, but there are others that sound dramatically better. Really, the one to judge everything against is the Laserdisc reissue from about 1991. It took the original 80s master, which is on the first LD. This was just analog only, though. And of course, the VHS and others were the same master. But this reissue basically upgraded it to digital sound, so you have the audio as digital PCM. And it's really the most untouched transfer of what seems to be the same audio that's been used for all these different releases. After this point, the releases usually applied some additional noise reduction or different EQ and things, and in particular, the Universal DVD and Blu-ray, they just don't sound very good, so Criterion doing a new approach to the audio is welcome, and it does sound better, quite better, than both the previous Universal Blu-ray and DVD. However, it still has some noise reduction applied, and it does have some EQ applied, and I think they were obviously trying to cover up or remove some of the source defects and the audio source they're working from. So basically what I'm saying is, very much like Citizen Kane, the mono track here on the Criterion release is better than the previous couple releases, but it's still a bit processed when compared to what I think is the best of the previous releases, which is the Laserdisc mono, which is best heard on the digital sound reissue Encore Edition disc. So basically, if you want the untouched or the mostly untouched version of this audio, you basically have to have a Laserdisc player. So the vintage initial home video releases really still have the best audio track in terms of the original analog releases, and then the digital Laserdisc reissue being the best of those. And then the Criterion release would be just behind them, where it sounds really good, but if you compared these directly, the Criterion track frequently sounds lifeless in some of the music, particularly in the louder passages. But it does sound better than the previous Universal DVD and Blu-ray. So it's basically kind of somewhere in the middle, but again, it is noticeably inferior to the PCM on the Encore Edition reissue Laserdisc. So this is another example of where the best audio is still locked to a dead media format because it's the one that has been messed with the least. Then we come to the packaging and artwork, and Criterion has created this custom mock-up of images of the film, and of course referencing the most iconic moments of where Walter Neff and Phyllis Dietrichson are inside her house and essentially hatching the scheme for doing away with her inconvenient husband. This is a nice, striking image image. It's nice to have the cover be in black and white for one of the most iconic black and white noirs there is, and of course utilizing famous imagery from the film. It's a good cover, but I'm not also entirely in love with it, because it's obviously cobbling together stills from the film, and it's a little bit different, and there's no appearance of Eddie G. Robinson's keys on the cover, who is really the heart of the film, and of course he's not on the original key artwork, which is on all the old video releases, but I do also like having original poster art as well. So this is a good cover, and I think it's nice having the sort of title font replicated from the original title sequence, and that of course goes onto the cover as well. So this sort of design and aesthetic and layout, I think, is similar to what we've seen on some of Criterion's other Blu-ray and UHD releases of classic 1940s films, or say, for example, their release of High Sierra. So it fits with their new aesthetic, and at least it serves the film well and represents it well, and it's not something that's just super arty like the Citizen Kane release, which also had, I think, one of the worst examples of packaging in all of physical media, so I'm very thankful they just kept it as a standard case as well. And we open to find this aesthetic continued on for the booklet, and then the disc labels actually have what seems to replicate the actual main title card. As Criterion does, we remove the booklet to reveal the UHD. So this is a dual Blu-ray set with the feature Blu-ray and then the supplements Blu-ray, and then the UHD is pretty much film and commentary only, but of course the UHD is hidden behind the booklet. Then we have the disc tray artwork, and they've chosen a singular image of Phyllis and Walter, so that's very effective and a nice choice. And then we have the booklet as well with the new essay, and again carrying over the same sort of art style, focusing on Walter and Phyllis. But unfortunately, and this is a note about the sort of quality control of a lot of modern Criterion releases, as you can see, I don't know how well this will come across, this is sort of warped and wrinkled, and it actually was this way when I purchased this brand new, and so I don't know if this just came this way from the factory or if it got water damaged at some point or something, but unfortunately my booklet is all warped, and it's also not stapled. It's one of these foldouts, but while we're used to this with Criterion, these are still awkward as heck, and people don't really make fold-out booklets anymore, so there's no reason you can't have a stapled booklet. It's also, of course, double-sided, as all of these are, which is, a little frustrating, and, I've just never been a fan of these, but, you kind of expect that with a lot of Criterion releases still. Another quick note about quality control: because these cases have a particular disc hubs, and especially when you have the sort of stacked disc on one side, it is quite common for these to get loose in shipping. So when you purchase one of these brand new, you want to open it and actually check your disc, because chances are there will probably be a floater disc in there that's probably gotten scratched or scuffed up. The Blu-rays usually aren't so bad because of their scratch-resistant coating, but UHDs are much more susceptible to having playback issues if your surface isn't clean. So you do always want to check those, because just the way these cases are, and especially having two on one side and then a booklet and single disc on the other, I've had several of these have loose discs. This did have a loose disc in it, but thankfully it wasn't scratched up. It was just the booklet that was all warped. The essay is quite extensive by Angela Jade Bastien. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So as you see, it goes on for quite a ways and then continues again onto the back side, and the restoration notes are just kind of tucked in there almost as an afterthought. The essay itself is good. It doesn't necessarily go over a lot of new ground, so if you've seen the previous extras from past releases, or you've seen the film before and kind of read up on it, it's not really gonna give you anything new. But also, rather interestingly, it then basically about halfway through then starts talking about issues of race, and also trying to look at the film from that social context, which, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what the author was aiming for with that. It just doesn't seem like it necessarily applies to this film in particular. So that was a bit of a head scratcher, admittedly. So with it being such an iconic film, I wish there was actually more material. And of course, I think we're kind of spoiled by other labels giving really extensive books to iconic films, but I just wish the essay in here at least was a bit better or had some more new material. It's still a solid essay, but again, I'm kind of perplexed at some of the points that are brought up that also I'm not exactly sure what the writer was going for, and also it's quite a long essay as well, and it's kind of disappointing that for a longer essay it doesn't really give you anything new if you've seen the film before. And then we have the rear in the usual Criterion style, which of course gives the information about the film, carrying over the art style of the front cover, and also going over the supplements. So to look at the supplements, again, this is primarily on the second Blu-ray disc for the video extras. But to go over all of these, we have the new 4K digital restoration with uncompressed monaural soundtrack that, again, does not sound as good as the Laserdisc from 1991 because people can't leave audio alone. Then we have the UHD disc with Dolby Vision HDR, and then the standard SDR Blu-ray, and then the second Blu-ray with additional supplements. So the first thing is, of course, the pre-existing audio commentary with Richard Schickel, which was done for the Universal DVD and then carried over to the Blu-ray. Now, I'm not a fan of Schickel's commentaries. I think they are frequently quite terrible, and I think most people agree with that sentiment. They're usually not very good and just sometimes a struggle to get through. Don't ever try to listen to his commentary track for Leone's Once Upon a Time in America, or you'll regret everything. But this one is probably the only solid or decent one of his I've ever heard. So it's a good commentary. It has a lot of gaps and lapses, and also is mostly talking about generalities and the basic sort of points of the film, but he also doesn't demean the film as he does some other films he's commented on, and he doesn't 100% of the time simply narrate the events going on screen. So it's an okay commentary. It's solid enough, and it doesn't really go over a lot of materials that you couldn't find out just by reading the film's Wikipedia page. So, at least we've got this ported here, so it's not locked to older releases, but this film really deserves a new commentary by somebody who really knows the film and adores the film and can really get into the nitty-gritty of why it's one of the greatest films ever made. But at least the commentary here is okay. I've listened to it a couple times over the years, and I think it's the only Schickel commentary that I don't actively dislike, so that's got to count for something, I suppose. In a real oversight, we lose the second commentary track, which was done for the Universal DVD with the late Nick Redman, who was the founder of the Twilight Time label, and writer Lim Dobbs, who knew Billy Wilder and actively talks about his experience actually knowing Billy Wilder personally over the years. And they both talk about what the film has meant to them, and they get into the texture and nuance of things. It's a really nice discussion commentary, and while it's not 100% always focused on Double Indemnity in particular, they talk about a wide range of subjects and really the city of LA itself and the concept of film noir. So it's a good discussion with a lot of good personal background and some background on Billy Wilder himself from people who actually knew him or met him, of course, much later in his life. So it's a really good listen. It is very rewarding, and it's an absolute shame it was dropped here. I don't know why it was. So you do have to hang on to the Universal DVD or their Blu-ray for the second commentary, which for some reason was not carried over here. And to be quite frank, it's a better track than the Richard Schickel track. So if we had to keep one of the two, it should have been the Redman and Dobbs commentary, not the Schickel one, but at least we got one of the two commentaries. But the second commentary is one of the two big things you lose from the Universal releases. The best of the new supplements is a new, pretty lengthy interview with Noah Eisenberg, editor of Billy Wilder on Assignment. So this is somebody who is essentially a Wilder biographer who's able to talk about Wilder's early days in Germany and his journey to America and getting his foot in the door in Hollywood and working his way up from screenwriter to partnering with Charles Brackett and then eventually being allowed to actually direct and also still write, so direct his own screenwriting work. And then basically laying the groundwork for how Double Indemnity was eventually produced and released in 1944. So this is absolutely essential for people wanting to know more about the film, more about who Billy Wilder was and what his background was, because I think most people who know of Billy Wilder don't necessarily know a whole lot about his background, his films before Double Indemnity, in particular his work in Germany and Europe before he even came to the United States. So it's a fascinating story. It's absolutely essential to have that context for what went into Double Indemnity. So this is absolutely essential, and again, easily the best of the new supplements on this release. Then we have another of Criterion's, I guess, new sort of style of having two critics talk about a film and just have a dialogue with a number of different topics. So this is, of course, Eddie Muller, the king or Tsar of noir, as we like to call him, and Imogen Sarah Smith talking about Double Indemnity. It stars Billy Wilder, Raymond Chandler a little bit, and of course, film noir in general. So it's a nice discussion. It goes for about, I'd say, 20 to 25 minutes, roughly somewhere around there. And I think this may have been done during COVID because they're recorded in separate locations, but it's, well edited together. But if you've seen any of these pieces Criterion has done on the releases of the past couple of years, you'll know what to expect. It's a good conversation, but they also don't really get into a lot of nitty-gritty details. So it is some of the stuff you'll see gone over most places. And again, it's just more of an informal discussion. So at least it's nice and pleasant and enjoyable to listen to, but it's just not quite as jam-packed with factual elements as the piece with Eisenberg about Billy Wilder's life and career. So these are nice inclusions, but again, I wish there was something with a little bit more meat to it in terms of just getting more hard-hitting facts in there. I'll also note that you'll see Criterion's encoding of extras come into play here, particularly on this one, that the bitrate is lower, and you do see a lot of compression artifacts and things in the backgrounds, which are of course out of focus, so it doesn't play into the viewing experience as much. But it is disheartening to see this pop up more and more on extras and supplements, where they're maybe trying to save space on a disc, but also you don't want big macro blocking or moving swirls around people's heads when they move in their chair a little bit. So you don't really see it in the Eisenberg one as much, but this one I did notice that, and I have seen that on a lot of modern Criterion releases where they've just got critics as sort of talking heads. You'll notice that there's lots of compression artifacts and such, especially if you're watching on a 4K television where it's just upscaled and really magnified. So I wish that wasn't a thing, but at least it's just people talking, so you've got just a shot of a talking head, and you can kind of forget or not look at the artifacts behind them. We have the vintage Shadows of Suspense documentary on the film, which was made for Universal's 2006 DVD, with Eddie Muller and a whole host of big name critics going basically through the production of the film and telling you all the general details you need to know in a really good, concise style. It's a really well done home video documentary, and it's really your best source for having a crash course in the history of the film. And once you see this, then you can go to the other supplements on this release, or read online elsewhere, or read Kane's novel, because you have this great basis in this documentary. So I think this is still the best overall piece on the film, and again, it is a standard def upscale because it was originally produced for the Universal DVD, and like most of these older standard def extras, they never really try and clean them up or re-render them as HD. So technically, I think the presentation actually looks a little bit better on the original DVD because you're looking at the original source file and then upscaling it, as opposed to having some other version years later. But at least that is included here, so you have the best overall extra on the film's history and its production, and it's really well done, so it's one that you can rewatch over and over. And it's also a bit lengthier. It's like 35 to 45 minutes long, so it's a bit longer than your typical sort of DVD featurette. This is a fuller, an actual documentary on the film instead of one of the more generic 10 to 15 minute featurettes. We have two radio radio adaptations of the film from 1945 and 1950. These are fascinating looks at how the film is adapted to the shorter and more streamlined radio format, and like most radio adaptations, they are presented here in lossy Dolby Digital quality. So they sound good, but of course it's limited due to being surviving radio shows. But it's always nicer when these can be put on a disc in lossless quality. But again, you want to save space, so I get that. But at least we have two radio adaptations here. We have the film's original trailer, but unfortunately it's a noisy standard def copy, so it's being upscaled on your television, and it's the same trailer we had on the past Universal releases, which also didn't look so good, so it really does need a new HD transfer, but unfortunately we didn't get that here. But the real highlight of this release is basically the bulk of Disc 2 and why this is a dual Blu-ray release, because we get the full Billy How Did You Do It, which is the Volker Schlorndoof, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, that's why I had to look at this because I can never say that right, but it's the 1992 film, documentary, conversation, if you will, where he sat down with Billy Wilder in Wilder's office and some other areas, and Wilder just opens up about his career and his viewpoints on life, and this runs for 3 parts roughly, but also is several hours long, and it seems like it was obviously, shot in 1992, and the overall quality here is a little bit limited due to that. I'm not sure if this is a standard def upscale or if this was made over as an HD master a number of years ago, but obviously the actual visual quality is a bit limited. But this is just priceless material. I mean, if you're like me and you're fascinated every time Billy Wilder opens his mouth and you have to see every interview he ever gave or read every interview he ever gave, then this is an absolute must. And before this point, the only release of this, you had to get the Eureka Blu-ray of The Lost Weekend, which included this in its supplements. Before this point, this actual interview material has never been released in its entirety on a main release, so this was a great thing to have on here, but of course it's not specifically about Double Indemnity except for those sections, but it basically, this is the same multiple hour documentary conversation Schlorndoof had with Billy Wilder that you saw on the Eureka Region B Blu-ray release of The Lost Weekend. So it's great we finally have this here on a US release, and of course that's why this is a 2 Blu-ray set, because those take up so much space and obviously necessitated having a second Blu-ray. So essentially Blu-ray 2 is not necessarily a Double Indemnity disc, it's the Blu-ray release in the US for Billy How Did You Do It? So it's essentially a documentary disc, if you will. I'm really glad this is here for people to have greater access to this. This is priceless material. You will be hanging on Wilder's every word, and if you've seen this before, you will gladly rewatch all the multiple hours of this all over again, pretty much start to finish in the multiple parts, because it's that mesmerizing. But it still makes me wish that this release did have some more extras on such an iconic film. We do have good new extras here, but as I alluded to, it doesn't really satisfy fully. And, the Criterion did do more extras for Citizen Kane, but I think this is a case where obviously I don't think any supplemental features package will fully satisfy a person, because this film is so iconic that no extras package could fully cover everything. But I do wish there was some more here, and if you looked outside the documentary, you pretended it wasn't here, this would be a single disc Blu-ray affair probably, and while the extras here are good, and some are really good, it's also just porting over the old DVD audio commentary and the old DVD documentary. It drops some elements from those releases, and you wish there was a new commentary and there was more new stuff here. So it's good they have the Billy Wilder documentary conversation here, because that helps at least overcome that slightly. But I do wish there were more supplements here for such a landmark, iconic film. The other thing you lose from the previous Universal releases is the TV movie version of Double Indemnity, which is quite frankly terrible and is a curiosity at best. It was finally resurrected for the DVD, which of course presented it on disc 2, and that's primarily why this was a 2-disc set. But this is the 1973 made-for-television film with Richard Crenna and Lee J. Cobb that basically retells the story of the film as we know it, but without any of Wilder and Chandler's touches and flourishes, and it's one of those great examples of having really good actors do a lot of the same dialogue, but nothing else is there. The spirit's not there, the energy's not there, the style's not there, and it's a 1973 made-for-television film, so, a lot of elements are toned down, and there's a general feeling of flatness, but they're trying, at least. It's just not working. There's no gas in the tank. But it was a fascinating curiosity to include in the Universal releases. So it is standard def on the DVD and ported on the Blu-ray. So again, the DVD is a little bit better looking, but this has been dropped for the Criterion release. I can understand them not wanting to include it because it really is not... It's really only for the diehard fans and the really curious to look at, and it's not good. I'll just put that out there. But it is a curiosity, and that is something to note that the Criterion release ported the Universal supplements, except they dropped the second and better commentary, and they did drop the 1973 television film adaptation. So ultimately, I think Criterion's UHD and Blu-ray combo release of Double Indemnity is the best for picture quality we've yet had on physical media. I think the restoration work and the new 4K master itself is about as good as we can do with the elements that survive. And again, it is a composite of different elements to fill in gaps and things. There is, of course, some damage baked into those sources and a quality loss because we're not working from the original camera negative. So what we're seeing is very understandable and is similar to past releases. So that's not necessarily something that's new to us because we're used to the film sort of looking a certain way because of the elements. However, it is an enormous technical upgrade over the Universal releases. And the audio is better, but the real big issue with this release overall is the fact that while the audio is better, it's still not as good as when it was left mostly untouched on the PCM Laserdisc reissue. So again, the Laserdisc in the digital reissue version, if you look at that PCM track, it is noticeably better than the lossless mono on the Criterion, which is also good and also coming from the same source, but it has been messed with a little bit. So it's sort of in between the over-manipulated Universal tracks and the untouched Universal track on the Laserdisc and the PCM reissue. And it's all the same audio source. It's just been handled different ways over the years. So the audio here is better on the UHD and Blu-ray, thankfully. But like Citizen Kane, it's not as good as when that audio source is left alone, as it relatively was on the Laserdisc here. So again, the best audio for Double Indemnity is still the Digital Sound Encore Edition reissue of the Laserdisc, which came out in about 1991 or so, and can be had quite inexpensively. So I do recommend fans of the film picking up a copy of this Laserdisc, and hopefully you have a working player, and then you'll have the best overall audio presentation of the film that is known to exist. So this is another of Criterion's must-own UHD Blu-ray combo releases. We do have a number of nice new supplements, plus most of the older ones ported over, and the all-important, phenomenal Billy, How Did You Do It? Volker Schlorndoof documentary, which is absolutely essential. So it's nice to finally have that on a US release. I do wish there were even more extras because this just kind of whets the appetite, but at least what we have here is a good selection, although I would have liked to see at least the second commentary also be ported over, and quite frankly, a brand new commentary that does the film justice, because while the second track that's not here is good, it's more of a loose conversation, and the Richard Schickel track isn't really up to snuff, so this film still is without a really definitive audio commentary, and this would have been the perfect opportunity to rectify that situation. So this is, I think, the best you can do overall with this film on physical media, except for the audio still being better on the digital sound Laserdisc reissue. So this is a case where I think you do have to go for the new Criterion UHD and Blu-ray release, whether you have UHD capability or not, but also supplement it with the Laserdisc just for the relatively untouched audio track. So those are my thoughts on the Criterion Blu-ray and UHD combo release of the iconic cinematic masterpiece Double Indemnity, still one of the greatest films ever made, and a film that really deserves its reputation and then some. This is the best the film has ever looked on physical media, and I think the Picture Master and the Dolby Vision HDR handles that as well as possibly can be expected. So I'm very pleased we now have an enormous upgrade over the very dated Universal releases. However, you do have to hang on to those for the other extras that have not been ported over. And again, the audio is still not as good as it should be because it's still noticeably inferior to the relatively untouched version on the PCM Laserdisc reissue. So that's how the film stands on physical media at this point in time. As always, I hope my babblings about the magical world of Double Indemnity, film noir, the genius of Billy Wilder, the artistry of Raymond Chandler, and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do pick up a copy of the Criterion release if you haven't already. If you've ever owned a version of this film before on DVD or Blu-ray, the upgrade is going to be quite staggering in terms of the new work that's been done, and the audio will sound better, but do keep in mind it's still not as good as the PCM Laserdisc from the early 90s. The new supplements here are rewarding and good, and we have the incredible Billy How Did You Do It documentary, which is an absolute must, and that's finally here on a US disc release. So you do have quite a bit of supplements to go through, and this is just one of the must-own Criterion titles, but I just wish it could be that much better to really perfect every element, because this is one of those films that truly deserves a perfect, comprehensive physical media release that also has enough care and attention put into it, and a large enough supplements package that really respects the film's iconic status. So I would have liked to have seen this get as deluxe a presentation as Citizen Kane in terms of more discs and more extras. Please, dear God, no, don't ever make that Citizen Kane packaging ever again, Criterion. But I do think there could have been even more extras here, or at the very least, a new commentary. And most of all, I wish the audio had been just left alone, so it's at least sounded as good as the early 90s Laserdisc does. But at least it is better, and everything here is an improvement over the Universal releases, but do hang on to those for their exclusive art and packaging and the exclusive extras that were not ported over. So, as always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.